so much. And thanks for having me, folks. Thank you, Silvia, for really putting a bit of a burden on my shoulders. I can't possibly touch upon everything you promised I would, but I'll give it a damn good try. And as with Silvia, I do have to say my thanks to this project that is now winding down. So on with the show. Let's take as our entry point for today debates on the mining law that spanned from 1894 all the way to 1895, and that was indeed the first mining law in quite a while in Romania. They are, I think, a good entry point for understanding how fears of colonization and logics of public scandal intertwine. This is to say that this is part of a broader research of mine, hopefully to materialize in my second monograph, looking at how, and I know this is quite surprising, the vocabulary of colonization, concepts such as colony, colonia, colonists, and colonization, though not yet colonialism, the ism comes a fair bit later, were part and parcel of public debates in Romania at the time, a country that was never formally colonized, nor did it really have colonies of its own, though we can have a little chat about that at the end. These scandals, we may think of them as acute moments of colonial anxiety, even though we have a more broader, let's say, chronic concern with these terms, which gives them the rhetorical weight that is then mobilized in such contexts. Yes, these debates were long delayed, they were contentious, not least because of the specter of economic takeover within what was now a growing public sphere, and Silvia has already touched upon this. By the end of the century, literacy rates were still dismal, yet the public that mattered was a growing urban stratum courted by the two halves of the bipartisan system. And colonization as an accusation was used, but also contested. I think this is the Liberal Party's, then in opposition, Liberal Party's main daily, the national will, international, accusing this law of not being a mere organic law regulating work and production in our country, as its authors claim, or a new impulse for the growth of national wealth, but the colonization of the country with foreigners, an attack on property, rural estates handed over to foreigners, the inalienability of peasants' lands destroyed. Clearly already we see here how the national territory is presumed to be part of a monopoly of the ethnic nation, which is to be unassailable even as growth and development are invoked as arguments for a law that would open up the possibility for foreigners to exploit mines and, crucially, later on, oil under concession. So what we do have here is a liberal opposition versus the conservatives in power, and in these debates, which, as I said, drag on for almost a year, references to past panics and scandals, already a growing archive of colonial anxiety is present at the time, are made. 1844, this is, I think, a fairly lone example, shall we say, but the first, the foundational one, in the first half of the 19th century, the so-called Trandafilov affair. At the time, the principalities were not only Ottoman client states, but also under a Russian protectorate. And in the Principality of Wallachia, capital of Bucharest, a Russian concessionaire by the name of Trandafilov had lobbied with the prince to gain the full concession for the exploitation of all the country's mines, which created a stir and ended up in the closure of the National Assembly for quite some time, but also even in the timidly growing public sphere at the time, the first major uproar over the potential that not only would resources be exploited in a colonial way by a foreign power, but also that foreign manpower would create colonies of foreigners which would have a dissolving effect on the nation. The liberal press also revived various accusations pertaining to conservative proposals. 1871, as Silvia mentioned, 1870 had their turning point in the Strussberg affair, and by 1871 we have the first stable government of Romania. It took them a while, a conservative one, and the conservatives had tried, though unsuccessfully, to modify the constitution in order to legislate for the settlement of foreigners as a civilizing and of course, developmental tactic. Fears of German colonization, and I'll get that in a second, were thus revived and invoked in 1895 as well. Interestingly then, Article 3 of the 1860 Romanian Constitution bans the colonization of peoples of foreign race or stock. Jimba would be the Romanian word, which does not necessarily carry racial connotations, but does speak to various Pan-Latin visions at the time. And already, as I mentioned before, a monopoly of the ethnic nation on the territory of the country was presumed, as was also manifested in the legal ban on foreigners acquiring rural properties. It is, I think, a rather unique provision in an age when colonization was encouraged. One need think only of the constitutions of, say, Mexico or Argentina. But here in Romania, although its elites perceived it as woefully and in fact dangerously underpopulated insofar as nature abhors a void and therefore attracts colonists, this was nonetheless a major issue. The question then is why? Why was Romanian nationalism, especially after the union that led to the birth of the modern state, 1859, and even after independence, as of 1878, fixated on the perils of colonization? I mean, there was no colonial victimhood, properly speaking, in the past, not by our standards, or even by the actors' standards, yet they nonetheless insisted on using the concepts in question. So this is part of the contribution to a broader European lexicon, I think, of core concepts that needs to be addressed as such, not to mention the fact that in the Kozletian tradition, if you will, the tradition of historical semantics, one glaring gaffe is, in fact, that of tackling colonization as concepts, as is, in fact, I'm sure you all agree, the disparity between the many intellectual histories of empire versus the rather absent intellectual history of colonization as concepts and not just practices. In context, what do we find? And this is a fairly longue durée perspective that I'm giving you here, spanning across the 19th century. But before the 1860s, there is an initial interest in the civilizing potential of foreign expertise, agronomic first and foremost, and capital that could be brought about by colonizing foreigners. Now, these projects, though they never materialized, recur throughout the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. Plans of bringing in Germans, and this is really the most important one, but one finds plans for Swiss, Belgian, French colonization. I could go on. These are not just these are not just propounded by various foreigners at various points in time. They are also met with interest by various elites in the Romanian principalities. By the 1860s, when there is, in this newly united state, a parliamentary debate on the possibility of legislating for German settlement on noblemen's lands, major uproar ends in an emphatic rejection. The conservatives are all for it, because they do own the land, but the liberals, who are more representative of the grand bourgeoisie, take a stand against it and already frame their argument in terms of development is good, but it should not come at the expense of the very existence of the nation. So it's really interesting to see that in 1894-95, parliamentary debates are still revisiting, rehashing this capital civilization development nexus. And this is a quote from a formerly radical MP that by that point allied with the conservatives in dismissing the nativist arguments of the liberal opposition. And he says, take for instance the Kyrgyz or the Laps, who of course show such piety to their ancestors that they do not want their bones to be plowed over or their blood to be profaned. And this is why they do not have a mining law of their own, prolonged the clause. Now this sort of racialized, condescending argument is interesting, if only because while it shows no real sympathy to those who are in a position of real colonial victimhood under the Russian heel or further up north in Scandinavia, but points to their backwardness as something self-inflicted when it comes to the march of progress. As Silvia has already made clear, infrastructural development is a magnet for scandals, but also, I might add again, colonial anxieties. So in broad strokes, My argument here is that anti-colonial discourse, with all its attending acute moments of scandal, is a secondary, rather than primary development of nationalism, right? It's not born from actual colonial relations, but it comes as part of the process, not as an impetus for this unyoking from the Ottomans or Russia. 2, it's less burdened by the need to culturally disentangle from the influence of a metropole, and more concerned with something, at least, with identifying a metropole worthy of emulation. And 3, it is a process that was paradoxically amplified rather than ended by Romania winning its independence. So, it's not the Ottomans. Even if Moldavia and Wallachia were client states of the Ottoman Empire up until 1977-78, the so-called ancient constitution, the corpus of more or less really existing, really half-imagined treaties with the Porte that had been concluded by medieval princes, one clause of which prevented explicitly the settlement of Muslims and of Ottomans on Romanian soil, was taken as clear proof that Romania had been unconquered, that these were treaties concluded not under duress but expression of agency, and, all things told, not the hallmark of a colonial relationship. Interestingly, it's not the Helenophone comprador intermediaries in the long 18th century that ruled the principalities, the so-called fanariots, that were seen as particularly colonial. Yes, there were some comparisons between, say, the fanariots and, for instance, the Spaniards in the New World. One finds references to the principalities being the Peru of the Greeks. But that interesting comparison didn't necessarily gain that much traction. What I would rather suggest as part and parcel of this anxiety is the fear of being part of a colonial continuum. The principalities were indeed surrounded by empires that had their own projects of internal colonization, which were perceived to carry the danger of spilling over, not least due to the expansionist tendencies of these empires. So we do have 2 core groups that are targeted by these colonial anxieties. And Sila has already touched upon both. I'm writing an article on, rather one article is already under review, the other just about to be sent off on each. The Germans, so as noted before, they were one of the most important groups that were seen as a potentially dangerous other, but they were seen nonetheless as being potentially civilizing even as settlement was being rejected. This notion that even before a Germany would be united, even as there were tensions between the Austrian Empire and the German states, a historical march of Germandom, not just eastwards, but also southeastwards down the Danube, was taken as a potential existential threat. It didn't help that one had various proposals in various German fora at the time by various German economists who did indeed say that instead of losing human capital to transatlantic migration, a redirection of German immigration down the Danube would be salutary. But these faint echoes were amplified in the nascent Romanian public sphere into what was an anti-colonial anxiety, a foundational one at that. There was, yes, a begrudging fascination for decisive potential, and this collided at times with the love-hate relationship that Romania had for its ruling dynasty. But this was more a geopolitical anxiety regarding a migration pattern than something really manifested against the actually existing German community in Romania. Now, this, I think, is in stark contrast with Romanian anti-Semitism. These, by the way, illustrations. This is the key pamphlet called German Colonists and Romania. It's really the expression of Romanian Teutophobia. Again, 1871, but first published in 1860-61 when proposals about colonization were dismissed. This is really just your run-of-the-mill anti-Semitic pamphlet. I've had the displeasure of reading a couple hundred, but this is a typical one. With the Jews, there is this intense fear of demographic takeover and the transformation of Moldavia, where the Ashkenazim had indeed emigrated in the first half of the 19th century in significant numbers, but then Romania at large, into a, and I quote, new Palestine. This was a future-oriented anxiety very much comparable to contemporary iterations of the great replacement canard. This notion that Romania would be conquered, would be colonized, this is the word used by Jewish presence, was a recurring one, and unlike Tudophobia, this had direct effects on Jewish life in Romania through systematic legal and extra-legal persecution, through a begrudging and ultimately hollow granting of citizenship on an individual basis after Romanian independence, and culminating in taking a very broad view in Romania's participation in the Holocaust. So anti-colonialism, as I said, appears to be something secondary. Romanian nationalism didn't start off by being anti-colonial in its early days before the 1850s. So unlike the classic case of a native intelligentsia critiquing colonial subjection, anti-Ottoman or anti-Russian discourse was not framed in these terms. This is a classic engraving, I think, by a German artist depicting the 1848 revolution in Bucharest. The revolutionaries had a complex program which included the abolition of serfdom, the emancipation of the Jews, the abolition of Roma slavery, but all of this, crucially, was directed against the Russian protectorate, yet at the same time framed as being entirely within the bounds of the relationship they wanted to maintain with the Ottomans. What is being burned here is not any charter that enshrines Romania's relationship to the Ottomans, but rather the Russian-imposed constitution seen as a core source of corruption for the state. Second point here, when we do find a reaction to any potentially colonial metropole, one finds an attraction to a metropole that is chosen rather than given. Let's just cast our minds back to Benedict Anderson's classic argument about living comparatively as a hallmark of the post-colonial condition. The subaltern, either in the process of or after emancipation, will compare themselves ceaselessly, obsessively, with the hyper-reality of the metropole's normative aspects of power and of civilization. But Istanbul or Petersburg were not really taken seriously as models at any point. It was Paris, on the other hand, for the early nationalist generation of nation-state builders that was seen as a potential metropole. And in fact, there is a recurring fantasy of acting as a French bridgehead in the Orient, sometimes couched in precisely and literally self-colonizing terms. This is, for instance, what we still unfortunately have as our best cultural history of Romanian Francophilia, even though it's more than a century old. And it shows its age by having in its preamble one of these examples, i.e. the fact that the author says, it's published in French, the guy is French educated, and what he says is, it all amounts to Romania being a colony of France, but that's a good thing. So this is very much a matter of the self-chosen metropole. And then, of course, there's the paradoxical application, and of course, this is the Strussberg question, and I urge all those of you who have not read Holly Cage's excellent Age of Questions, do read it. It is a wonderful book that puts the idea of what a question is in this, at a time when the social or Eastern question were all the rage. You have all these minor questions. Independence is not the inauguration of a post-colonial relationship with the Ottomans, as stated already, but it is marked by fears of dependency. And as Sylvia has already explained, the Strussberg affair as a protracted scandal that juxtaposed itself with a struggle for recognition and with entwined German and Jewish anti-colonial xenophobias shows that much of this language and its acuteness and its violence comes not as an impetus, but something that comes after the affair. Even as independence is being gained, the fear of colonization grows ever stronger. So this makes a circle back to 1894, 1895, and beyond. What can we draw as conclusions from what I've just said, if briefly? Well, the scandalous nature of colonization as an anxiogenic possibility was there, even if it was never materialized. 2, potential corrupting nature it was imagined to have on the ethno-national body politic. And this is something that I may have, should have, ought have, my apologies for not having done so, should have given you a few more quotes on that. But again, this discourse of corruption, the potentially corrupting effect that implanting through colonization foreigners into the body politic was very much there. There is then the gradual emergence of a historical archive of colonial scandals. In 1895, pamphleteers were able to look back and point to previous anxieties. It's multi-directional, right? Multiple xenophobias entangled, and the two major ones, as Silvia has also said, were xenophobia and anti-Semitism. But it's not that you always have a universal link between the two. You could have xenophobias without a local component, is what I mean. Then, I think I'm preaching to the choir here, there is the importance of recovering the colonial as a category for historical actors. Just as everyone here will agree, we must be fully cognizant of what language, what concepts actors use at a time, and be mindful of the gap between our analytical vocabulary and theirs. And finally, and this is hopefully the selling point of what I just said, there are counterintuitive chronologies to the anti-colonial as a feature of European nationalism. Right, thank you.